And so I get a thumbs up from James. We're ready to go. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I will now call the Standing Committee on Rules Procedures to order. My name is Kevin O'Reilly. I'm the MLA for Frame Lake and chair of this committee. Today's meeting is being live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels. To respect physical distancing requirements, other members and our witness, Dr. Aleksander Essex, will be attending by video conference. I'd like to remind all members and Dr. Essex that all comments, questions, and remarks will need to be directed to myself as the chair. Both members and the witness will need to wait to be recognized by the chair before speaking. Our first order of business to open up our meeting is a prayer. I'm going to ask MLA Thompson if he would like to do a prayer for us this morning. Can't hear Shane.
Dear God, thank us for this day as we work for the residents of the Northwest Territories. Please look after our home, people back home that are sick, and our elderly and our youth. Please allow us to have opening ears and listen to Dr. Essex as he presents information that will help us move forward with the Northwest Territories. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thanks, Member Thompson. Appreciate you doing that for us. Our next item on the agenda is review and adoption of the agenda. Mr. Clerk, would you like to walk us through the agenda?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On the agenda today, committee will be hosting a public hearing as part of its review of the Chief Electoral Officer's report on the administration of the 2019 general election. And joining by video today, you'll have Dr. Aleksander Essex. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Clerk. Any additions or changes to the agenda from committee members? Not seeing any, so can I get a motion to adopt the agenda? Member Thompson, thank you. Motion is in order. All those in favor? No objections?
Agreed.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Jacobson, for joining us by phone. Motion is carried. Having reviewed and adopted the agenda, are there any declarations of conflict of interest? Not seeing or hearing any. I think we're ready to proceed into business. And the first item is a public matter. Today we're joined by Dr. Aleksander Essex. Thanks very much for joining us by video conference. Dr. Essex is an associate professor of software engineering in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Western University in London, Ontario. This meeting is committee's second public hearing in its public review of the report of the Chief Electoral Officer on the administration of the 2019 general election. We intend to hold additional public hearings, including a public hearing during which members of the public will be able to make comments, and that'll come later in this summer. We will advertise that meeting, of course, ahead of time. Members of the public will be able to make written submissions to the committee as well. Committee certainly looks forward to hearing concerns and comments from the public as we work our way through our process of reviewing the report from the Chief Electoral Officer. And then, of course, we'll prepare our own report that will contain our recommendations, and that will go to the Legislative Assembly of the House for consideration as well. So before we move to Dr. Essex and his opening remarks and presentation, I'd like to ask members of the committee to introduce themselves for the record, and I'm going to start with member for Cam Lake, who's joined us in the committee room.
Thank you very much. My name is Caitlin Cleveland. I'm MLA Cam Lake.
Mr. Thompson, over to you.
What are you looking for, Kevin?
Just introduce yourself, please.
Okay, sorry. Shane Thompson, member from Nahende. Thank you.
Mr. Norn, do you want to go ahead, please?
Hello. Sorry, I joined in late there. I was having some technical difficulties, but yeah, my name is Steve Norton. I'm a member for Attorney of the Will today.
Thank you, Mr. Norn. And last but certainly not least, we have Mr. Jacobson here on the phone line with us.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Jackie Jacobson, MLA Nanakput.
Great, thank you very much. We are joined in the committee room with by our clerk, Mr. Michael Ball, and our committee researcher, Stephen Dunbar, as well. And I think we have, oh, sorry, I may have missed Mr. Simpson. Are you on the phone as well with us this morning? Can you please introduce yourself?
Thank you. Rocky Simpson, MLA, Hay River South. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Simpson, for joining us. And sorry, I missed you. I can't see sitting here who's actually on the call or not. But and I think we're joined by Kathleen Knuch, one of the research advisors for the standing committees as well. So I think that's everybody that's here for the meeting. And of course, we're joined by the public who may be watching on the Legislative Assembly social media because this meeting is being live streamed. But without any further ado, Dr. Essex, we welcome you and thank you very much for joining us. I assume that you can hear us all okay?
Yes, yes, Mr. Chair, thank you.
Okay, great. Why don't you please go right ahead into your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee for extending this invitation. Truly, it's an honor to have the opportunity to speak to you, and I'm also impressed that you guys are also hard at work. You know, the day before Canada Day. I know some other legislatures might be, outdoors right now, so I appreciate that. May I have the next slide, please? Okay, so
great. Sorry.
Yes, thank you.
We just want to make sure that we've got the slide up here, Michael. Okay, great. Thank you. Oh yes, James. Sorry, I neglected to mention James, our intern, who's joined us in the meeting, and he's going to help you with the slides. But please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So normally, in sort of the computer science world, there's not a culture surrounding talking about one's expertise. It's kind of considered unseemly. But in this particular case, I do just want to, list some of the things that I've been involved with, just so that you are aware of sort of my background in this area. So I have been doing research on election cybersecurity going back, over a decade. It's my predominant research expertise is in this area of elections and cybersecurity, and I've done studies in Canada and elsewhere in the world. So I know a lot about this topic, and I do have some things to share with you today based on some of the research I've done. And so I'll just leave it at that. But I did want you to sort of at least be aware of something about my background. So next slide, please. Okay. So first, I want to begin by just saying, just to make it clear that I'm not here. I don't see myself as here to in any way comment on the election itself or the results or the outcome. I have nothing to contest or sort of complain about in that regard. So I just want to make that clear. And also in addition, I also want to point out, just take a moment to acknowledge my appreciation and deep respect for the Chief Electoral Officer. Canada, I've had the opportunity to interact with a number of Canada's Chief Electoral Officers, and we have some of the best election administrators in the world. They're all fantastic people. We're so lucky to have them. And so I think that's worth pointing out. Their job is extremely important to the well-being of Canada, and they don't get nearly enough credit. So I've pulled up a headline here, and I'm not commenting on the headline itself. I'm commenting about something on the byline about the Chief Electoral Officer describing a sentiment of confidence in the online voting system. Now, in the 2018 Ontario municipal election, we also saw a lot of online voting use. Northwest Territories is really taking the leadership in Canada in terms of adopting online voting at the subnational level, so below the federal level and above the municipal level. But the main users of online voting so far in Canada have been at the municipal level, especially in Ontario and Nova Scotia. So I've had the opportunity to do some studies in the Ontario context, and I think there's a lot of overlap with your situation that's worth commenting about. And one of those points is this notion of confidence. So this is a term that we hear often municipal clerks in Ontario say, especially when they're interviewed in CBC. So something sort of standard outcome will be, the CBC will ask me to comment on something about the cybersecurity, and then they'll ask one of the municipal clerks, and then the clerks will say simply, well, we're confident in the system. And sometimes they won't really kind of elaborate what they mean by that. So I just want to begin by sort of asking a few questions and sort of having that sort of lead the way. So the first thing is that when you are a municipal clerk or a chief electoral officer, and you procure an online voting system and you describe a sense of confidence in the cybersecurity, a natural question that a member of the public might have is, well, how did you become confident? How does one reach a state of confidence in the system? What is the means by which that is accomplished? And then, of course, is that confidence justified? Would a subject matter expert in the field also reach a similar conclusion? And then, what about the confidence of the electors themselves? Is an election administrator's statement about confidence, should that be enough for the electorate to themselves be confident, or do we need more? So next slide, please. So to the point about how cybersecurity was evaluated in the context of Northwest Territories, in the Chief Electoral Officer's report on the administration of the 2019 Territorial General Election, the CEO describes reaching that confidence through a process of a general penetration testing methodology. So a penetration test is a cybersecurity methodology that involves hiring a company with some expertise in cybersecurity and having them essentially being kind of like good guy hackers. They sort of take on the role of trying to act as the bad guys, but in an instructive way. So they'll try to break in, they'll write a report about it, they'll share those findings, they'll make recommendations, and that's a sort of a standard tool of any industry today. Any company or organization today utilizes this methodology to make sure that their systems are secure. But the question is not whether our general penetration testings, or we call them pen tests for short, it's not, are pen tests good and are they needed? Yes, they are needed. The question is, are they enough, right? So can a pen test tell you what you really want to know, which is the election itself secure? And so the point that I would like to present to the committee is no, they're not sufficient. And they they tell you a lot of things, but there's some really important things that they don't tell you, which is some of the things I would like to talk to you about. So what are the limitations of this methodology? So next slide, please. Okay. So here's 5 things that a pen test doesn't tell you. Now, these 5 things may or may not be an exhaustive list. These are just 5 things that I was thinking about. I'm not presenting that as a systematic list, but I think it's a good conversation starter. So one of the first things is that a penetration test is a generic cybersecurity tool. It looks at generic IT threats. So the kind of methodology that would be applied to your election infrastructure would be very similar to what would be applied to, say, like a bank or just an online business in general. So it doesn't consider the specific domain-specific requirements of an election. So one of those things that makes elections different than, say, for example, online shopping or online banking is this thing called ballot secrecy. So it becomes really difficult to offer a sort of a verifiable result that is also still secret at the same time. That's one of the reasons why elections in a cybersecurity setting are very hard. Election cybersecurity in some ways is one of the hardest to open cybersecurity problems. It's not like online banking. It's not like online shopping. You know, if you buy something online and then it doesn't show up, you notice, you know that it doesn't show up, and you have a remedy there, which is you call, Amazon, and they'll send you another one. So we don't have that same kind of environment in elections. The elections as an IT challenge are very special. They have a lot of things about them that make them unique and make them really hard to analyze. So a generic pen test is just not going to tell you everything that you need to know. Another component of this is that it's incomplete from a threat analysis standpoint. What pen tests typically do, and what was done, my understanding, based on what the Chief Electoral Officer's June 10th statement to the committee was, it was twofold. One was what's called a black box test, which is the pen test folks look at the servers, and they're not given any information about the election per se, and they see what they can see. They see what they can do, what they can break into, what kinds of vulnerabilities they can find. Then they did what's called the gray box test, which is they were given the opportunity to use the voting interface. They got to be the voter. One thing they didn't do was, my understanding is they didn't do what's called a white box test. So they didn't get to sort of look inside and have that sort of privileged viewpoint. So now I don't know what's in the pen test exactly in this particular report. But in general, penetration tests don't consider the full slate of threat actors in an election. So threat actors are sort of the fancy way of saying the people who could pose a threat to an election. Now, I don't fault them for maybe not being exhaustive about this, because we find that there's a lot of cases where it's not being sort of completely exhaustively looked at. So, for example, the CSE, which is sort of Canada's, IT sort of, their intelligence agency, has a report about threats to elections, cyber threats to elections, and they don't touch on these full suite of threats either. Now, if we go and look at, for example, the United States, so the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, does consider a slate of threats that are not maybe being considered here all the time. So those things include threat actors like insiders, so vendors, equipment operators, staff, and these aren't. This is not to say that they are threat actors, that they are going to work against the best interests of the election. Simply that they have privileged access, and that needs to be considered when when you're doing your threat analysis. If somebody was to misbehave, what could they do to the election? And so pen tests don't really look at what the insider access sort of viewpoint is like. They typically, the threat that they're sort of simulating is being sort of, bad guys and some sort of, on the internet generically. So it's not really a full range of what kinds of threats elections have to deal with. Okay. Another aspect is the emphasis. So a penetration test tells you about the technology, but it doesn't tell you what you're really interested in. So the thing that you want to know is that the election was counted right. If you're a voter, you want to know that your vote counted, that the person that gets elected is really the person that should have been elected. That's what you want to know. But a pen test doesn't tell you that. So as an example, one way you could think about it is like, imagine that you are an insurance company and you want to come up with an insurance rate for an automobile. And you look, the insurance industry looks at all the risks, right? They look at the driver and what neighborhood you live in and what model of car you drive and, what sort of other insurance agencies do. They look at the kind of complete picture. But what the penetration test is doing here is kind of similar to as though you had a mechanic look at the car and then say, well, I did a safety inspection and it passed. Now, in this case, we don't even know what they looked at. But again, the fact that the car's brakes are working doesn't tell you enough about what the risk is of getting into a car accident. And that's really, I think, an important point to make. It's not maybe obvious. And again, in Ontario, using these penetration tests as a sort of kind of using them as a stand-in for a comprehensive analysis is something we see a lot. They're also non-instructive in the sense they don't give you instructions about what to do. They tell you about vulnerabilities. They help you fix them. Again, these are typically generic IT vulnerabilities. They tell you how to fix them, but then they don't tell you what to do when things go wrong. They don't tell you about the kinds of things that you should expect or prepare for as an election administrator. And there are some very specific things that are, again, they're unique to elections that we have seen that I'm going to share some examples with you to sort of, talk about things that as an election administrator you need to prepare for. And this pen test will not tell you about. Now, the last point is, in many ways, I don't know, maybe the most important. This pen test, so this was a cybersecurity report that was done by Hitachi. I don't know who commissioned the report, whether it was the chief electoral officer, the vendor, or the intermediary, the DataFix. I haven't seen the report. I asked to see the report, but I was told I was not able to see it. I understand that members of the committee saw it, so you might have a better insight into what was tested. But the fact is that the report was not made public, and it was only made available to the committee some number of months after the election. I'm guessing it was probably not made available to all the candidates who had a stake in the outcome of the election, merely the people who are involved in the government at this time. Now, I want to show you something here. This is a penetration testing report from an American mobile voting company. So this is the U.S. mobile voting company. They sell a mobile voting solution. This is the firm like Hitachi that does penetration tests that did the report. So now this is a penetration test that was made public recently. And so I guess the question, if I was in your position, the question that I might have is, first of all, why is the Hitachi report not made available to the public? And whatever answer is given, to ask as a follow-up question, how does that differ? How does that circumstance differ from other penetration tests that are made available publicly? I won't speculate on why it's remained secret, but I would be interested to know what is different about Northwest Territories situation than another situation elsewhere. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so this is some text from the Elections Ontario's post-election report, and I'm not including it because I want to have some kind of don't want to I'm not looking to play off the two election agencies against each other by any means. It's simply that I think that there was some language in the Elections Ontario report that I think really kind of strikes to the core of what I'm trying to say here. So one of the things that Elections Ontario has realized, especially with all of these cities using online voting, is that the public is becoming increasingly aware of this technology and its use, and they're starting to ask some questions. I know in my case, in the case of Northwest Territories election, I got a lot of interest, a lot of people asking me about it. I was interviewed by CBC multiple times, and I had the opportunity to discuss the Northwest Territories system in lectures that I gave in the U.S. and in Australia this past year. So there's a lot of interest, and keep in mind that there's other election agencies in Canada that are looking at the Northwest Territories example to sort of see what they might do. But the point that the Ontario Chief Electoral Officer made about online voting use in general is that in the long term, as the public is becoming more aware of this technology, in order for the public to sort of trust this technology in the long term, they need some assurances, and that they need to be essentially confident, or at least have some way to be confident, some sort of independent way for them to come to the conclusion that the technology is going to protect their vote. The vote will be counted. It'll be secret. It'll be verifiable and protected. They need some kind of way to be assured of that. So now the question that I would ask, again, if I was in your position, is did the Hitachi penetration test answer any of these questions as a member of the public? Now, again, I don't know what's in the report because I wasn't allowed to see it. But I think that fact alone should be an indication that the public doesn't really know what's going on. And at least in the case of Ontario, we've seen a situation where online voting use has kind of gone along for a while. It's kind of flown under the radar. But in the 2018 Ontario municipal election, we for the first time started to see people getting sort of a little bit, having questions about how the technology works and discovering that they couldn't get answers to those questions and being very surprised and very shocked. In one case, it led to a lawsuit in Lambton Shores, which is still ongoing. And I'm concerned that in the Ontario 2022 municipal election, that we might see more turmoil over what exactly this technology is doing and how it's enforcing any of this stuff here. Next slide, please. Now, here's just for some background context, here's two examples of things that have happened around Canada with online voting use. So out in Alberta, you had a case where there was some suspicion over voter fraud that had to do with the weakness of the credentials. Like I was a deputy returning officer. I worked the polling station in the federal election last year, and that's a paper ballot election. And so I had voters coming to me, and my poll worker would take their ID and we'd strike them off the list. But in an online system, and my understanding from what I have been able to figure out about the Northwest Territories online system, you are looking at some kind of email, potentially date of birth combination, some kind of login credentials, some sort of knowledge factor. Now, the problem is that when you log in as a voter, you're proving to the server that somebody knows this information. You're not proving that you're you. You're just proving that somebody knows this information. And so we had a lot of situations, anecdotal accounts in the Ontario municipal election of spouses voting on behalf of each other, or parents voting on behalf of children who went away to university, and the PIN would arrive in the mail and they would vote on their behalf. Or I've talked to candidates that ran in the election who described accounts where people would give their PIN mailers away to their neighbors because they didn't want to vote. And in one case, there was this incident where there was this dead dog that was accidentally put on the voter registry. That's not the issue with online voting so much as when you sign in, you don't know the person that's signing in. You don't have a human being standing in front of you. You just have this credential, and credentials can be shared. Next slide, please. Okay. Another issue that we had in Ontario 2018 was one of the vendors had a major bandwidth problem on election night. So this was in the Ontario municipal election, and so there was like 40 some odd cities contracted to one particular vendor, and the websites were just down. I actually was looking. I was looking at the login page loading times, and on the night of the election, and you could not log in. So effectively, the election went offline. Now, that's a problem, obviously. But I think the bigger problem was that in many cases, the municipalities in question didn't have a plan, didn't have a backup plan. And that's a problem as well. But I think the bigger problem was that they didn't think that they needed a plan. So as sort of what often happens, I get a call from CBC and they ask me a question about something related to online voting. And I'll say to them something like, okay, well, here's a question. Here there's 35 questions. Here's one of them. What happens if the website goes down on election night? And they said, okay, good question. They went to a couple of clerks, interviewed them, and at least one admitted that they didn't have a backup plan. They hadn't worked out what they would do if the election went down, if the voting website went down. And so they ended up having to use emergency powers to extend the voting period into the following day. And, I won't get into the whole question about whether there's some disenfranchisement argument there. The point is that as a general principle of an election, it needs to be available for people to vote. And if something goes down, this is a problem. Now, you don't see this in a paper ballot election. You don't see one little technical glitch bring the whole house of cards down. But in an online system, sometimes you do. Now, just to clarify, the vendor who had this happen to was not the vendor that you used in your election. It was a different vendor. But the general principle is the same. Because online elections are different, and because they're so new, in many cases, we find that the election administrators haven't gone through the range of possibilities. We haven't had enough experience yet to tell us what might or might not happen. Now, in this case, we knew about this threat beforehand, and I was even in the news talking about it, and it still happened. These are the point is to sort of elaborate how things like, for example, the penetration test probably didn't tell you about the likelihood of this happening. They might have looked at this resilience against denial of service attacks, which were outsider threats, but they might not have looked at the risk of an insider making an error. This election night problem was created by a miscommunication between the vendor and one of the subcontractors. So it wasn't just an accident; it was a miscommunication. So these are things that happen that really affect the election, and so we need to sit down and think through them. Unfortunately, there are currently no standards for online voting in Canada. It's one of the things I've been trying to work towards with some of my colleagues here in Ontario, is to try to sort of raise this issue. Because right now, what we're seeing in many cases is, especially in Ontario, municipal clerks that maybe don't have a strong background in cybersecurity or the cybersecurity of elections. And then the vendor is telling them sort of one side, which is, look how great our product is. And they're not getting that other side, which is, what happens when. Now, you might think that this is an unusual thing to happen, but this also happened in Australia. And so I actually testified at the the New South Wales Electoral Matters Committee in February, because this thing happened to them, where the system went down and people weren't able to register to vote. So next slide, please. Okay, so I took a look at the elections and I think it's the Elections and Plebiscites Act for the Northwest Territories, and there's this provision about the secrecy of the vote. That's a fairly standard requirement around the world. There's nothing unusual about it, and there's a pretty strong understanding among average people that the vote is supposed to be secret. I know when I was doing my poll worker training for Elections Canada last year to work in the election, I know that the trainer asked the room, to articulate why the vote needed to be secret. And they went around the room and everyone had a sort of a pretty strong understanding of why you maybe don't want somebody to have a master list of every person's name and who they voted for. That might be used for political purposes that aren't good. And, you can sort of let your sort of mind run wild about that one. But the point here is that there's often a disconnect between what the law says and what the technology does. And that disconnect, I think, is going to make a real problem for jurisdictions using online voting eventually. I think that there's a possibility, and I'm not a legal expert, so you'll need to consult with actual legal experts about this, but as a technical expert, I would be concerned that there is an opportunity for there to be some kind of legislative reaction to some of this stuff based on what the technology is doing. So, for example, the act on the left says that no person should attempt to obtain information about who a voter voted for. But that's exactly what the online system does. When you log in to the online system, you provide the system with your identity. Now, that might be your direct identity, like your name, or it might be an indirect identifier, like your date of birth and your email address and the city that you live in. And in that same web session, you send your ballot choices to the server. Okay, so the server gets and sees both of those items. So, I guess there's maybe a legal question about whether the server and the vendor constitute a person. But I think that this is I think that the technological reality of what actually happens is not necessarily known to the average person. That the vendor has this sort of master list of identities and votes. Now, the vendor might say, well, we don't use this information for any other purpose. But I think it's important to point out that as far as we can tell from a technological standpoint and based on our black box testing, because the vendors typically won't give us access to see what they actually do, it seems to be the case that they get this information. So there's this sort of tension between sort of this idea that no person shall get this information, and on the other hand, you must provide this information. So I know that one of the things we're worried about down here in Ontario is whether or not this will cause a situation where a voter might say, I'm faced with a choice. I'm faced with a choice on one hand between revealing this private information to a for-profit company that, we hope that they're not going to do it. They're ostensibly not doing anything with it, but that's what I have to do. And on the other hand, if I want to prevent myself from having to reveal that information, I could just not vote. That's the only way for me to stop this. Now, in the case of Northwest Territories, somebody that was worried about this would just be able to go and cast a paper ballot. But in Ontario, we saw many cases where the cities eliminated paper ballots entirely and had an only online system. And so there's some question about whether or not that's, that exposes the city to, some legislative argument about that. So that's something that the legal community needs to explore in this country. It, as far as I know, has not been explored. So next slide, please.
Sorry, I'm just going to interject for a second. I think we're about halfway through. Maybe we could see if you can speed it up a little bit, because we want to leave some time for our committee members to
Okay. Okay. Thanks. Yeah, I asked what the time limit was, but I'm unfortunately wasn't able to get an answer on that. So I apologize for not keeping it within time. I wasn't sure what the time was, so I'll speed it up. So here's a chart that just shows we did a research study in Ontario, and we said, okay, well, maybe when you log into the system, you're not giving your name, but in Ontario, 50% of the voters are uniquely identifiable by their date of birth and the town that they live in. So, even if you don't log in with your name, you're still identifiable. So, this is something that needs to be looked at. Next slide, please. Okay. The other important point to make is that, as a mental model, that online elections are not local elections. It's not like going down to your local church or community center to cast a ballot. When a Northwest Territories resident casts a ballot, as far as we could tell, the ballot is transmitted to a data center in Toronto, a Cloudflare server. That's a US-based company, and then is... at that point, we can't see beyond that because, in the public, we don't have a deeper view. But, it somehow makes its way to the vendor, and then those results come back. So next slide, please. One of the concerns with that is that this US-based company, and again, it's not about Cloudflare in particular. I've talked to these cloud providers before. I think that, they're reasonable. I have nothing to say about them in specific, but I think it's worth pointing out that at some point when one of your voters casts a ballot, their ballot goes to one of these servers and exists in an unencrypted, unprotected state. So you are relying on the cloud provider to not look at it and not change it, because they could. Technologically speaking, they could do that. I'm not saying they would, but they could. And that's an important part of your threat analysis to understand what's possible. Next slide, please. Diving into the weeds just a little bit, we did a study in Western Australia looking at, the reason you use one of these cloud providers is you're trying to make your election robust against denial of service attacks. So one of the ways that they do that is they act as a kind of an intermediary to inspect connections as they come in. So what that means is that the voter isn't interacting with the vendor's software directly. They're interacting with this intermediary company. That's who their computer talks to. And what that means is that it's that company that is managing the encryption keys. So in this case, in the Northwest Territories case, it was Cloudflare managing those encryption keys. Now, it's important to understand that Cloudflare has data centers all around the world. So, the encryption keys that are being used to secure the connection between the Northwest Territories voter and the Cloudflare server, those keys live in all of these data centers around the world. We saw it serving out of a server in Hong Kong. The Northwest Territories, the key that protects it. Now, we wrote about this a number of years ago in Australia, and these cloud providers offer a service to turn off these foreign data centers from having the key. Now, as far as we could tell, that was not done in the case of Northwest Territories. So that's another thing that I don't think is very election specific that I don't think the pen test would have caught. Next slide, please. Okay. So another thing that hasn't been, as far as I can tell, hasn't really been looked at is the security of the voter's device. So there was a situation where rather unfortunate situation where the chief electoral officer and I were sort of in the news together, kind of being pitted against each other, discussing this issue of client-side security, and how, could you modify a voter's computer to switch votes? And the point I was making is, yeah, you can. There seems to be no measures in place to prevent that. The vendor was also interviewed, and they said, well, it would be really hard to do that. But our research said, well, no, it's not only is it not hard to do that, but we actually developed a little USB key here. There's this little device called the USB rubber ducky, and you plug it into a computer, and it just flips open a terminal and just types in this stuff. And then when a voter would go to vote in their browser, it just switches the candidates. So, we're talking about like one line of code. And I'm not saying that I think this is going to be a big threat. My point is simply that this threat is being overlooked. And in one case, CBC was saying that what was the term, that they were, deflating the significance of this threat. So I just think that, if we're going to be honest about all of this, we got to look at the sort of the full suite of threats and what they mean in practice. Okay, next slide, please. All right, and so at the end of the day, this is sort of a high-level view of kind of what the technology does. So voters cast a ballot. They don't talk to Northwest Territories Elections NWT. They talk to Cloudflare, who talks to a co-location provider, who talks to Simply Voting, who talks to the chief electoral officer, who then announces the result. Next slide, please. From the perspective of the voter, or more importantly, from the perspective of the candidate who loses the election, this is what they see. They see a mostly opaque process. Now, in Ontario, when the 2018 municipal election happened, I got a lot of phone calls from council candidates. I spoke to mayors, deputy mayors, councillors, people that ran in the election and lost. And in many cases, they lost. They said, okay, I lost. But in some ridings, some towns, the elections were very close, and they were surprised by their loss, which could be for completely legitimate reasons. I mean, people lose elections or win elections all the time. The polls are inaccurate. That's not the point. The point is that, they would tell me, these mayors would tell me stories of losing the election, calling the vendor, asking, how did this online system actually do this? If you had to do a recount, what would that look like? And the vendor would just not tell them anything. They would say, well, that you're just going to have to go and talk to your municipal clerk. And then when they would go talk to the municipal clerk, the clerk would say, well, we don't have that information. It is the vendor's view of the situation. So you can't do a freedom of information request from us because we don't have that information, and we're not going to ask the vendor to give it to us. So we have a situation here where, everything is great. Online voting is great. I mean, it's awesome until it isn't, until people start, like what Elections Ontario was saying, until they start asking questions about it. And then they find, much to their surprise, that in many cases there aren't really a lot of answers. So that leads me to a couple of recommendations I'd like to make. Next slide, please. I noticed in the Chief Electoral Officer's a final report about the post-election business that they are asking for the Act to be changed to allow online voting to be a permanent option. So what I would like to recommend is that the committee consider not amending the Act until there's some kind of cybersecurity standards developed, because there's just so many technical issues here that I'm seeing being overlooked or, arguably downplayed that I think can't be. I'd like to encourage the Elections NWT to look towards developing or adopting standards. They might pursue that alone or in partnership with some of the other chief electoral officers. I know that we desperately need this in Canada, so I would like to see some kind of process. Next slide, please. And finally, to what the Elections Ontario report was saying, it's important that if you're going to do this, that you are going to provide electors with some kind of independently verifiable evidence that their vote was counted and that their ballot secrecy was maintained. Because in the long term, if you don't work towards providing this, it's going to lead to situations where, that people are going to start asking questions and not getting answers to things. And that's going to lead to, I think, in the long term, some difficult situations that your government or other governments in a similar position might eventually have to face. So I'm saying, let's not wait. Let's anticipate these things now and work towards providing this information. After all, it is the voters' election, and so they deserve to have a stake as stakeholders in the election to know that their information was counted correctly. So with that, I would like to thank Mr. Chair, thank the committee, and invite them to ask any questions they may have.
Great. Thanks very much for your presentation and the slides you provided ahead of time. I'd like to go to committee members to see if they have any questions. So Mr. Thompson, Mr. Jacobson, Mr. Norn, any questions? I think I see Mr. Norn's hand waving just in the corner of a bit of the screen. I can see Mr. Norn, please go ahead.
Yep, Masicho, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that presentation. Just going through all of this, it was a very interesting presentation. The one thing that kind of just stood out for me, and you mentioned that one of your last recommendations was not to amend the Elections Act until these cybersecurity issues are addressed. So that tells me, one, that we do have some issues there that need to be addressed, one. But so I guess if we did a cross-jurisdictional scan, like I say, a province, a state, a territory, in your opinion, what, and this is towards Dr. Essex, is that, what do you think, who's the gold standard in terms of online voting systems right now in North America? Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Norn. Dr. Aleksander, are you able to hear that okay? And can you go ahead and respond? Thanks.
Oh, sorry. Yes. My mistake. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the member for that question. That's a really excellent question. What is the gold standard in North America? I'm not sure that there is a gold standard in North America. If there was a gold standard anywhere in the world, not necessarily for the system itself, but for the process and the sort of the rigorousness of the process, it probably would be in Switzerland, where they acknowledge that there are these many difficult issues. And the way that they're approaching it is to put sort of tiers of limitations. So maybe it's one thing to say, well, we'll let absentee voters use the online voting system. If something goes terribly wrong, at least it's not the entire population. But in Switzerland, what the federal chancellery there has sort of put into essentially statute that to grow that to a larger segment of the population, like if you're going to have half the population voting online, that now you need to have some kind of process where they're going to tell you about what they're doing in very uncertain terms. And if you wanted to have the entire population voting with this technology, they need to start providing evidence and proof that everything is counted up correctly. So most recently, they're not without faults. They had a major vulnerability analysis. One of my colleagues in Australia and some of the researchers in Switzerland found some serious vulnerabilities in the Swiss Post system last year. But I think it's a testament to what Switzerland has done to respond to that, which is they've striked a panel of experts, European experts mostly, to come in and really think through all of these problems. So I think that their approach is probably the most enlightened in the world at this time. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Alexander. Member Norn, any further questions?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. Thank you for that response. And I guess that I have a couple other questions I have. And just thinking, I always like to think of scenarios and I look around, did some research on this, and one of the things I hear about a lot of our current system, the way it's put in place, is it's akin to like online banking, where you have to verify your identity, then you do your voting. I guess for our voting systems up in the territory, the way we do things, I mean, the margins are pretty narrow. Like Canada could win by 1 or 2 votes. That's how we have a small population. And for me, I always feared that we could have some wily hacker come into our and penetrate our voting systems and fake identities and put up fake votes. So, do you think that have you ever seen this type of I guess penetration happen anywhere else in the world? Thank you.
Thanks, Member Norn. Dr. Essex, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the member for the question. Okay, so to the point about online voting versus online banking. So again, the key difference there is that in principle, the bank knows everything about your balance and who you spend money with and where the money's coming from and how much and when it comes. And in principle, you're not supposed to know that in the election case. Now, I think there's a case to be made that the vendors do attain that information. I think there needs to be at least a national conversation eventually about what that means. But I would just say that these two notions of online voting and online banking are extremely different. And if I could sort of put that out there as just consider that they have very different requirements. In terms of narrow margins, I certainly sympathize with the concern there. And in terms of have we seen the particular identity management that's being used in these online systems, have we seen it lead to problems? And the answer is yes, we have seen it lead to problems. So there was the reporting out of Alberta about the votes of several voters ostensibly being sort of captured by some political organization or somebody. We're not sure. The RCMP is investigating that. The story that CBC reported was that the members would have the login credentials delivered to their email address, but the attackers had changed the email address in the registration, so it went to a different email address. So they never got their credential to vote. In Ontario, we saw lots of anecdotal accounts. These were members, council candidates running in the election, describing situations where parents were taking their kids' credentials and voting on their behalf. There were neighbors taking credentials from others and either giving them or taking them. So the identity management is not the same. If I have a password and a date of birth, that's what the server sees. Somebody knows my date of birth and knows my password. Is it me? Well, not necessarily. And so I think that's one of the things to realize. Ultimately, online voting is an unsupervised polling place. This is also true for vote by mail, by the way. That it's unsupervised. That means that we've seen examples, in the U.S. of spousal. I don't want to say coercion, but there's interactions there that happen among family members. So those are all things that need to be considered. But in terms of like the first major instance of voting fraud in the world, I don't think that we have seen that yet, and I don't want it to happen in Canada. I don't want us to be the first timers on this. But what's happening at this point, it's possible that we would eventually go towards that. Maybe not Northwest Territories, maybe in another place. But there's nothing that prevents it fundamentally at this point. The way that an in-person place does. And not that in-person's perfect either, but it doesn't have those same threats. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Essex. Member Norton, any follow-up or further questions?
Yeah, just one follow. I just wanted to verify. You said something about like maybe a post-election kind of follow-up, for online voters to verify if people voted or not. I'm not sure if I caught that, but I think it would be a good idea to actually, if there's a lot of online voters in the future in the territories, it'd be good to just to confirm and say, hey, listen, like maybe get a call from the electoral officer, say, just calling you, Mr. John Doe here, if you voted in the election. If they said no, and then all of a sudden it shows that they're voting, I think that'll bring up some red flags. Do some sort of a poll or survey post-election. I think that'd be a good idea, and I guess that'd be my suggestion. I'm not too certain if you mentioned that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Member Norton. Dr. Essex?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and thanks to the member for that comment and that recommendation. Certainly, I think that the member is thinking along the right lines, and certainly thinking along the lines of the kinds of thinking that they have in the United States about trying to sort of verify things after the fact. And you can do that by sort of sampling things. You can sort of do surveys. I think that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that we saw in Ontario was there was some concern about whether or not a lot of votes might be cast from a single device. You want to talk about red flags, that would be one of them. So if half the ballots in the election came from one IP address, we might want to know why. That information, unfortunately, is the kind of example where we would try to do a freedom of information request, and the city would say, well, we don't have that information. The vendor has it, and so it's not in the city's domain, so we can't give you anything. So those kinds of red flags that might be there just aren't, we don't have access to that information. So, recognizing that when you finish an election, you want to have certainty. And so, we have to be careful not to create uncertainty, but we also need to be careful to identify these kinds of red flags and understand what they mean. So, not everything's been anticipated ahead of time. So we sometimes need to go back and look at these things. There needs to be a mechanism for this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Essex. I guess voters might also have the right to not disclose whether they exercise their franchise or not. So anyways, it does raise some interesting questions there. So other committee members, any questions? Mr. Thompson, I see your hand up. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Dr. Essex. Thank you very much for this presentation. Got my head wheeling there with all this information, and lots of questions here, but I'll try to focus my questions on, we talked about the pen test, and then that there was 3 there. Does, in other jurisdictions, do they do all 3, or they just do the black box test? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Mr. Thompson. Dr. Essex, I guess he's wondering in particular if white box tests, as you characterize them, are common in other jurisdictions, but please go ahead. Thanks.
Yes, well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the member for the question. I think it's wonderful that we're talking. I don't get to talk about white box, gray box, black box pen tests just every day, especially not with legislators. So this is really, really cool. So in the case of Ontario, so Ontario, I would say, is the main other example in Canada. Ontario and Nova Scotia, they're the main examples of online voting use. So I haven't studied the Nova Scotia case in detail, but I have studied the Ontario case in detail. And I can tell you that similar to Northwest Territories, the extent of the penetration test and the penetration test report itself, the findings, are typically not made publicly available. So we actually don't have an accurate a sense of what is normally conducted. Now, in the case of Ontario, you have a lot of you have a big difference between a large city like, say, Toronto, and then a very small town, with a couple hundred people in it. So the ability to conduct penetration tests varies across towns. The interest in it varies across towns. So at least in the Ontario case, I can say if there was a standard, we don't know what it is. But the one thing I would say is that at least one example in the U.S., the most recent example that I'm aware of, it was made available. This is the Trail of Bits penetration test from Votes. And so I think that that's an important and an encouraging step. However, I would also add that again, a penetration test is not nearly enough. What we need to develop in this country is standards to guide legislators such as yourself, when they're interacting with their chief electoral officers or municipal clerks or what have you, to be able to ask some important questions of these vendors. Consider that in many cases, like one of the issues that we had in Ontario was there was a particular case where there was two vendors working together. One was sort of the front face and the other was the vendor running the actual technology. Most of the city councilors didn't know that there was this other company involved. This is a Spanish company who, by the way, now is going through bankruptcy proceedings. In many cases in the U.S., the vendors won't disclose their ownership information. They actually consider the ownership structure of their company to be a trade secret. So I think that there's a lot of secrecy going on here. And again, in a corporate environment, that's maybe completely appropriate, but these are public elections. So there needs to be more transparency. So anything that you can do towards providing that transparency is something that you should work towards, hopefully. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Essex. Mr. Thompson, any follow-up or further questions?
Yeah, no, you just made me write down a couple more before I get to my other questions here. So when we talk about standards and there's nothing across Canada, is this now, would you say this should be a federal regulated process, or should the territories / provincial governments take on this task? Because you just blown my mind here, and you're making me ask a whole bunch of questions, and my head's trying to think here. But so when we talk about standards, and we're proud of what we did, but if we're not there's different standards for different people or different provincial jurisdictions, and should this be a federal government thing, or should we as a territorial government be looking at developing our standards that we need to implement, because we're still waiting forever maybe to see something else happen? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Mr. Thompson. Dr. Essex?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the member for that question about standards. I agree with you. My mind's spinning about this issue as well. So the answer to that question is the short answer is it's complicated. I can tell you that I've written on this subject both multiple times in the media and sort of op-eds. And in journals. My colleague, Dr. Nicole Goodman at Brock, and I just recently published a paper in the Election Law Journal about a pathway to standards in Canada. And so there's a number of ways that you can approach this. So in the United States, for example, what they do is they have a federal agency called the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. And they provide standards. They actually work with the federal standards agency to come up with requirements and actually make standards. But the standards are voluntary because it's the U.S. states who make decisions about their how elections are run, including the federal elections. So the idea in the U.S. is that they have a federal sort of conversation starter, if you will, and then states make their individual decisions about what to adopt and what not to adopt. Some actually take the voting standards and the state will pass a law saying these standards are our standards. Others will modify them, and others, I think you can imagine the states that I'm thinking of, they just sort of ignore them altogether and they do their own thing. So something like that might be possible here in Canada, rather. I certainly would like to see some kind of federal agency formed eventually that could take on this role to provide the thought leadership for the country, whether or not that is adopted by the Northwest Territories or not. That would be a long-term conversation. In the meantime, I think that there's no reason that the Northwest Territories themselves couldn't and shouldn't consider this question themselves. Maybe not even standards exactly, but at least having some kind of independent process involving multiple stakeholder groups, subject matter experts, just a wide, field of input on what kinds of things should we be asking of the vendor when we contract the vendor. My understanding from the Chief Electoral Officer's report was that the contract was between Northwest Territories and DataFix, and that the contract with the vendor was not between Northwest Territories and the vendor. So there's sort of like a layer in between there where there might not be an opportunity to ask all the questions and get all the answers that you might seek. So long term, the answer is the entire country needs something federal. In the medium term, in the next 10 or 20 years, I would say that each province should and territory should look to develop something, because right now we are kind of flying blind, and there's a great vast amount of knowledge that exists around the world, and we need to start tapping into that knowledge to ask these kinds of questions. What can go wrong, and what kinds of protections do we need to make sure that when things do go wrong, it's not a really big problem. So far in Canada, we've been okay with the online voting, but the important thing is that people need to understand you don't necessarily need a hacker to disrupt an election. All you need is for somebody to lose the election and then say, well, I don't think I lost, and then challenge it. There are certain high-profile examples in the United States of where this is happening, but there's also been examples of this happen in Ontario as well. I don't want that to happen to you fine folks, and so I think that having something formalized would give you a layer of protection from these kinds of future concerns. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Essex. Mr. Thompson, any further questions or follow-up?
Yeah, I got a couple more for sure. If Dr. Essex answers the questions, and I may end up having more, but being respectful, we have other committee members. So with your indulgence, I'll just do these two, and then I will pass the floor to other people, Mr. Chair. So my next question is, when we talk about, there's a company, a vendor that, that you talked about has gone bankrupt. In that, and my concern is, what about the data? Like, who owns that data? I know when I asked the question of the Chief Electoral Officer, we were advised that it's our data, but if it's company goes bankrupt and all of a sudden that data becomes still in their system, so who does that come back to us, or go back to the people that have it, or is that just out there in the open? I guess that's one of my questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Mr. Thompson. Dr. Essex?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the member. So data ownership is another one of these really, I think, important questions and largely unexplored questions. I know that we looked at the data ownership policies in the contracts in Ontario that we were able to get our hands on through Freedom of Information requests. I have not seen the contract that was negotiated in Northwest Territories, so I have I don't know what was said. I did see that the Chief Electoral Officer indicated that Northwest Territories is the owner of the data. But there are certain questions that we do have. So, for example, how is the data retained? And also, is there any way to derive?
Hey,
Bad time?
no, just on a conference call, but yeah.
Sorry, Dr. Essex, we'll mute Mr. Thompson and you can
Okay.
just keep going, thanks.
So one of the questions we had is, so for example, the data is owned by Northwest Territories, let's say, but what about derivatives that statistics, for example, that are derived from the Northwest Territories data? Is that also owned by the Northwest Territories? So for example, in Ontario, we saw some of the demographic reports that some of these companies keep about who votes and what method they use. So we saw a vendor provide the city clerk a report showing who voted by time of day, age, sex, and other demographic information. Now, it didn't say who they voted for, but again, if they are getting that information, one of the kind of the sci-fi scenarios that we worry about is could they start using that information in a kind of like a sort of deriving statistics from it and then using those statistics to sell information as a third to third party members. So I think that the arrangement about the data maybe has to be a lot more specific than just we own it. Because again, I can think of lots of scenarios where the company says, okay, well, we're going to give you your data back, but we also might use some of the information that we got to sort of, they might use it to like tweak their business. They might use it they might sell certain demographic information in aggregate form. I mean, this is what companies do all the time, right? It's your data, but they put it into statistics and then they sell those statistics to third-party companies. So one of the things that I'd be worried about as a vendor, because these are for-profit vendors, is, well, what happens? This is an unexplored legal issue as far as I know. What happens if I want to, as a vendor, do the exact same thing that all the telecom companies do? So they take the location data of 1,000 people, and then they kind of put it into sort of a blob, and then they sell that to some company that wants to know, how, what people visit what stores on what times of the day, or send advertisements to individuals that, are visiting certain stores. Again, telecom companies and other companies use your data that's ostensibly your data for third-party purposes all the time. And so what I would want to know, if I was in your position, is that legally possible under the current arrangement that you guys have with these vendors? And again, I don't know if you are actually, I don't know if your contract is with the vendor or if it's with just DataFix, and DataFix separately has their contract with Simply. So that's another thing that you might want to explore. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. Mr. Thompson, any further questions, follow-up?
Just one other question, and I apologize. I found the mute button now, so I apologize, and thank you for people telling me that I should find that button. My last question here, well, I have more, but my last one for today is when we talk about recounts and the challenges that we've seen, and as MLA Norn talked about, that, sometimes elections really, really close. And how can the online voting, how can you do the recount, or can you not? I guess that's the question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Mr. Thompson. Dr. Essex?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the member. First of all, I spoke at the Federal Parliamentary Procedures Committee 2 weeks ago, and they also have this issue, and I actually had a problem with my mute button. So we're in a new world here, so it's all good. As far as recounts go, I mean, this is like, thank you for asking that question. This is a really important question because, again, this is such an important point. online voting is really fundamentally different than paper ballot, the mental model that most people have about how elections work. In a recount, in a traditional election, you go back to the paper record and you count the votes again. The assumption there is that the paper that was cast on election day is the same paper that exists at the time of the recount. And I mean, you could get into scenarios where, it was maliciously modified, the paper record's modified, but let's set that aside and let's just assume that you can have a chain of custody that is legally valid. So this is exactly what they're trying to do in the United States. They don't do full recounts. They do these things called risk limiting audits, where counting everything again is too much work. And they want to make sure that their optical scanners are counting the paper correctly. So they'll go and they'll roll some dice, and the dice will tell them some random ballots to go find and look, and then they'll count up that little random sample. So you can do this with a paper ballot. When you talk about an online vote, you are in a totally different, you're in another dimension. Okay, so the notion of a recount doesn't have the same guarantees, right? So you had a software program that worked initially. It took a bunch of inputs, it ran the program, and then it produced an output. So if you have the same inputs again, the program will count them up again the same way and give you the same result. So, what you would likely find if you did a recount is that you would get the same number back. Now, the question is, what does that tell you? Does it tell you that the thing that was counted the first time was correct? No, it doesn't tell you that. Does it tell you that the program that did the counting was correct? No, it just tells you that it was counted, it was run, the same input was run through the same program again. So it's not telling you what a paper ballot election would tell you. So to sum up, to answer your question, no, recounts are not possible, at least not in a way that is, I think, meaningful, that would tell you something different than what was reported previously. And that's really an important point. There are no risk limiting audits for an online voting system. The closest thing we do have is something called cryptographic end-to-end verification. That's something I worked with colleagues all throughout my graduate school. It uses cryptography to prove that the vote was counted up correctly, so you can get recounts that way. But there's a lot of that's not a straightforward, that's not a slam dunk. That's like technology that's going to take years to develop. So the short answer to your point is that no, you can't really do a meaningful recount in an online vote. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Essex. I won my election by 11 votes, and there was a recount. So anyways, I'm not going to do any more than that. But I've got Mr. Thompson, we can put you back in the queue. I'm also cognizant that it's 11:30 and we want to wrap this up. We've got another meeting at 1 and we want to have a bit of a break between. But I know that Mr. Jacobson doesn't have any questions. Mr. Simpson, are you still on the line, and do you have any questions, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for the presentation as well. I guess the questions I have here, when I'm looking at this, I'm just kind of wrapping my head around it, is that, the first thing I look at is like everybody should have, like anybody who has the right to vote should be able to vote somehow. The second thing is that they have to know, again, like the doctor was saying, is that, your vote, you have to know that your vote counted, or you should be able to know your vote counted. And then there has to be that secrecy aspect of it as well, that nobody else knows. And it's hard for me to wrap my head around that with online voting, considering that you can get somebody else to do it for you by providing them passwords or other information. And then the other thing is with standards and privacy, I guess, is that, at what point, I guess, down the line, are we going to have something that's acceptable that we can hang our hat on, I guess, knowing that when we do vote online, that we're going to meet all the criteria that we want. And I guess that's where I'm having my problem. And the other thing is, I guess, just looking at your recommendations, I look at the first one is, you do not want us to amend the Elections Act. But on the second recommendation, say, if we do use it, or if we go ahead and use it. So I'm just kind of wondering here is do you think that should we be using online voting in the Northwest Territories right now, or should we hold off until such time that we have some standards in place that we know that are acceptable and that will protect the identity of the voter and ensure that the voters are looked after that way? Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Simpson. There was a lot there, but I'm sure Dr. Essex will do his best to weave his way through and give us an answer. Please, Dr. Essex, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the member for those questions. I really appreciate the questions that you all are asking today. I think they're really excellent questions. Some of the best questions I've had out of some of these appearances. So, I really appreciate the amount of thought that you're putting into this. So to the member's first question, how do you balance integrity and privacy? The reason that it's not like online banking, and that is an excellent question, because there's not really a good answer to that. That is why online voting is so hard to do. If you didn't have ballot secrecy, you could do online voting in a lot easier circumstances. In fact, that's why I was testifying at federal parliament a couple of weeks ago. I was pointing out that you can use online voting for legislators because their votes, typically the divisions are a matter of public record. And so we were talking about how to do that in a cyber safe way. And so we know how to solve that problem. When you put them together, it makes things really, really difficult. And that's why it's a huge open problem. In terms of how long will it take to create standards, that is also an excellent problem. The short answer is at least many years, but it doesn't mean that. So there's different tiers that you could go about doing this. So instead of creating standards right out of the gate, because that's a longer term process, ideally it would involve a lot of different stakeholders and experts from sort of a diverse group of people, not just the vendors telling the election agencies sort of their point of view. You could do things in the meantime, like having just some guidance documents. These things can be developed more quickly. Here are the 10 things that as an election official you might want to ask the vendor about. As far as how long will it take until this country has standards, I think it could take decades. I joke to my colleagues that I will just be happy if we can have something before I retire. And I don't know how long that's going to take, but it's going to take a long time. But I think we can do things. We can do things more immediately, and maybe that's sort of where we can sort of focus. But the Northwest Territory certainly could initiate its own process to start working towards that. So that was just kind of where I was going. As far as options, policy options go, yes, my primary recommendation was to not use it because there are these outstanding questions. Like the weak authentication, the ballot secrecy. How do we prevent this third-party company for having this sort of master list of people and their votes, and how do we prevent these cloud providers from also having privileged access? I mean, we need to look at these issues. So until we've really sat down and even identified what all the risks really are, I don't think that it should be used. But in the event that the Northwest Territories, and I'm only making a recommendation, if they decide to continue using it, okay. then my recommendation in that circumstance would be to limit it to what you're doing right now because of the risks. And then if you can't limit it, then at least sort of pursue some of these avenues of providing public evidence. I mean, the public evidence is where we want to get to eventually. Any of these things are better than nothing. And so I'm just trying to provide several shades of options for you to consider in your fine work in your legislature. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Essex. Mr. Simpson, any follow-up questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I guess my concern is that in the NWT there, where we've only got 45,000 people here, and a lot of people we know each other, so secrecy and is important. The other thing is that because some of the voting is so close, that there is that potential to manipulate an election. It sounds like it through online voting, possibly, and that's a big concern of mine. The other thing here I just want to touch on is the company that's, I guess, providing that service and for the online voting. And my understanding here, maybe I'm wrong, is that you've got somebody that we enter contract with, but it sounds like there's other players down the line that we don't have contracts. We may not have a direct contract with. Maybe the provider does. So that, and I'm not sure, but that seems like that could be a potential problem as well. Like the information is getting bounced around from provider to storage facility and on and on. So I guess just maybe if you can comment on that there, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Simpson. Dr. Essex.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the member for the question. So to the member's first point about secrecy being important, yes, it's a sort of a very a global level principle of most democratic elections today, and it's also a part of the Act, the Elections Act, that governs your elections. So there is an actual statutory obligation to provide the secrecy beyond it just being a good idea. The old saying, it's not just a good idea, it's the law. So I think that needs to be explored to the satisfaction of the legislature. Now, you might explore that issue and conclude that it's sufficient to allow the vendor to get that kind of information and be trusted to not do anything improper with it. You might conclude that, but the first step is you have to know that's what the technology does. Then you have to decide what you think about it, and I don't think those things have happened yet. So in terms of the players that are involved here, there are numerous entities involved. So in addition to Elections Northwest Territory, you have DataFix, who manages, obviously, the lists. I'm not sure that I don't think that DataFix sees voters' identities and votes together. But the people who do, at a technical level, as far as I can tell, are the cloud provider. In this case, it's Cloudflare. I've talked to cloud providers. They point out that their business model is heavily dependent on people perceiving them as trustworthy, so that's a major reason why they wouldn't do anything wrong with that data. But they also are subject to intelligence agency requests and so forth. So it's not really clear. We're talking about maybe not at the territorial level, but certainly at the federal level, nation states, advanced nation threat actors are involved here. So, that's certainly consideration at a federal election if they were to consider this. That's why the federal government doesn't do online voting. I think it's an important point to make. So the cloud provider, behind the cloud provider is what's called the co-location provider. So they're the people that have all the computers. And so this is the co-location provider was the one that set the bandwidth restriction in Ontario. So they get all that data on their devices. That's their computers that receive this Northwest Territories voters' data, the vendor would have a contract with them. I don't know who they are in this case. And in the Ontario case, we couldn't even get that information because the vendor wouldn't tell us. So we didn't actually know who their co-location provider was. I ended up finding it in a staff report at one point, finally. And then there's the vendor themselves. So there's at least 3 parties that are getting access to this sensitive information. And again, maybe you would explore that issue and discover that it's, under certain agreements that are in place, maybe you don't have a problem with that. But again, the first step is that you have to know that's what the technology is doing, and then compare that technology against what the legislation says and see if you think that it lines up. Because certainly from my perspective, again, not as a lawyer, I have questions about whether it lines up. And so far, at least in Ontario, that hasn't been tested. And I think that eventually we will see it tested in Ontario, and eventually I think it will be tested at increasingly higher levels. I don't know if it'll take 10 years or 20 years or what, but by the time I retire, I think that we'll have seen some major cases that test some of these questions. And so I just wanted to make you aware that that's sort of where I see the puck headed in the long term. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Essex. Mr. Simpson, anything further?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Simpson. We've got Ms. Cleveland here in the room, so I'm going to turn to her for some questions as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question, we've heard a lot today about different red box and black box and gray box and different potential risks that online voting poses. And so I guess my first question for you is, do you think that it is possible to properly run an online election that still maintains the integrity of democracy? Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Cleveland. Go ahead, Dr. Essex.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the member for that excellent question. And what a question. Do I think it's possible to run an election using an online system that preserves the respective principles of democracy? That's a complicated question, and I think it has a complicated answer. I don't want to keep you guys all day, but let's just say that I think that I'm not convinced that the technology that is available to us, or at least that has been used in Canada currently, is able to provide those, to meet those democratic principles. So, with regard to, for example, ballot secrecy and ensuring one person, one vote and enforcing that, I'm not sure. But I do know that we are not getting any kind of clear picture of what is being done to know whether or not it's good enough. So we have to, in many cases, just sort of work off of what we suspect is happening. I mean, I have to, when I look at these systems, I'm looking at them as a black box. I don't know what's going on behind the curtain. And in many cases, they won't tell me what's going on behind the curtain. And I'll ask, and I won't get that answer. So it's a complicated question, and it's a hard question to answer. But to sort of give you an answer, a short answer, I'm skeptical at this time. And there are ways that we could imagine getting to a point that I think that even computer scientists could be happy about. But that would involve some of this cryptographic technology, and that's a long way away. So my role is maybe not so much to comment about this, but to just sort of make you aware of these risks and hopefully arm you with the information that you need to maybe answer that question for yourself. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Essex. Ms. Cleveland?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that answer. I guess my next question is, you're privy to a lot more information in this world than I have any experience in, and so I'm wondering if you're aware of any kind of known failures of the voting software that is currently used by Elections NWT. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Cleveland. Dr. Essex?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the member. No, I'm not aware of any concrete failings of the software as it was used in the 2019 election. I am also not aware of the presence or absence of malware on any voter's device. I simply don't know what was enough about what was done to reach a determination like that, and that's part of what I think is the thing that I would like us to one day be able to move beyond, where the sort of independent experts. I mean, it's like I don't have any stake in the Northwest Territories politics, so I'm not trying to. I don't really know what to say. I just want the best for you all, and I'm raising some of these questions because I am concerned about what might happen. But I don't want to comment, or I don't have enough information to comment on the election itself. Merely the process of selecting the technology and the process of auditing the technology. That's sort of what I'm here to comment about. Thank you.
Fair enough. Thanks, Dr. Essex. Ms. Cleveland?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm wondering if Dr. Essex knows of any attempts at kind of online voter fraud or online altering any online voting results in Ontario or Nova Scotia. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Cleveland. Dr. Essex?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the member. So I have not studied the the Nova Scotia election in detail. So I don't have any specific instances of voter fraud that occurred there. In the case of Alberta, there was a political party that ran a leadership vote where there are currently allegations of voter fraud. So I'm aware of those allegations. They've been reported widely in the press, and I've been interviewed in those cases and commented about them publicly. So I'm aware of that as being an alleged instance. I'm also aware of alleged instances in Ontario. Again, these are anecdotal accounts. They were given to me by candidates who ran in the election, and after the election, they lost, and they were surprised by this. So they, wanted to get in answers, and I ended up talking to them, and they would call me up. I'd be putting up my Christmas tree, and I would get a phone call from a deputy mayor, and they would tell me about sort of what happened, and they want sort of my input on this. And so in several instances, I was in those phone calls related instances where there were where people who had voted for those members had approached them and said, "Look, I'm aware of these incidents." So this is not these. I call them anecdotal accounts because they're not proven in a court, but it's, I think, certainly plausible that this is the kind of thing that happens. So this is votes being exchanged between family members, votes being exchanged between neighbors. Let me clarify: voting credentials, the thing that you need to log in, and there were anecdotes, absolutely anecdotal allegations of people who are not authorized to cast a ballot for a particular credential, casting a ballot for that person. Now, we have not reached a point where we're able to prove conclusively that this has happened. So I can't put that forward to you as a concrete allegation, but I do know, I recall speaking to one mayor. This mayor explained a case to me where a supporter had spoken to him after the election and described a situation where she had gone to work and she had come home and her husband had taken her credential and voted for her. And so this particular candidate had said to this particular voter, well, did you report this instance to the authorities? And the candidate told me that her response was no, because she didn't want her husband to get into trouble for, a municipal election vote. So, I mean, the point is, it's possible for this to happen, and we certainly are having anecdotal accounts of this. I think that we will eventually get to the point where we are seeing cases where this happens, where they are proven in court. But certainly we're not at that level yet, but I think we're moving towards that. Thank you.
Keith, thanks, Dr. Essex. Ms. Cleveland, anything further?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just one follow-up question. Early on in the presentation, Dr. Essex spoke about websites going down during election day and the potential for that. And luckily up here, we still have our different other options for people to go and vote. But do you have a recommended solution given the large cost of these websites to begin with? It's not likely you would have, a backup and a backup to your backup of these types of websites. So do you have a suggestion of how to mitigate that? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Ms. Cleveland. Dr. Essex?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the member. So how do you mitigate a website from going down? Well, the first thing is, like, step number one, you have to acknowledge to yourself that's a possibility. Now, that might seem like an obvious statement, but it wasn't an obvious statement to at least 40 some odd municipalities who didn't have a plan in place. Now, as an IT person, websites, I can tell you, they go down all the time. Now, in this case, it happened because of a specifically, unfortunate circumstance. But you have to know that this can happen, and you have to not be surprised when it happens. You need a backup plan. The way that you approach that backup plan, I think, is a conversation to have with your chief electoral officer, and I think that the chief electoral officer is going to have probably some pretty good alternatives in mind for you, if that was something that you were sort of expecting. So anything ranging from mail-in ballots to emergency, like actually printing ballots on an emergency basis, extending voting periods, and so forth. These are all tools that clerks in Ontario used when they went down. So that's something that can be explored. But again, the most important thing is step one is that you have to know that these things absolutely can happen. And it's not like they don't happen. They happen in Ontario, they happen in Australia, and heaven forbid they happen in another 3 years in your election. But you need to, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Essex. Ms. Cleveland? Okay. I've got a couple of questions myself. Been waiting pretty patiently. I think it's fair to say that we've talked a lot about the risks of electronic voting here today. And I think I have a much better understanding of what those risks are. But that there are benefits as well. I had a son in the 2015 election who couldn't vote because he didn't get a paper ballot in time. That was the way that we tried to handle absentee ballots in the last election. So there are some benefits to electronic voting, and the uptake was only, I think, 3 or 4% of our electorate this time. You're well aware of that. But I want to turn to page 5 of your presentation, and you outlined a number of reasons why a pen test is not enough. And when I look at these sorts of things, it's almost like you want an independent third party to be able to verify somehow that all of the different parts of the system actually record things as they should, and that information is transferred in an appropriate way to the cloud, and that nobody has an opportunity to manipulate data and so on. Are there, who actually can carry out these kinds of higher level tests that you seem to be suggesting here? And, who can do that work, and is it done in other jurisdictions? Thanks. Maybe I'll start with that one. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the question. So regarding risks versus benefits of online voting, I want to make sure that I don't come off as sometimes some of my colleagues in the cybersecurity world do, and sort of project myself as not acknowledging the great many benefits of online voting. And certainly in certain circumstances, especially situations like absentee voting, there may be a stronger case for it than the general election. I would remind the committee, however, that they are being asked as a recommendation by the Chief Electoral Officer to put this into law, my interpretation is for a general and a permanent basis that at least the option existed. So I think that the risk grows as you grow the amount of people voting online, and at a certain point, that risk might exceed the benefit. And at that point, if the risk is exceeding the benefit, then that's not a good thing. The problem is also that I'm not sure that the risks have been accurately calculated. And again, nothing against the fine work that Elections Northwest Territories has done, because this is like we are at the beginning of something in the world about understanding what these risks are. Like, as I said in my presentation, even the CSE, the intelligence agency, the Signals Intelligence Agency of Canada, I don't believe has fully understood what the risks are. And so, we are in the process of kind of figuring out what those risks might be. This is like a global effort right now. So it's hard to talk about risks and benefits if we don't actually have a way to kind of compare them. But it's a fair point, and there absolutely are benefits to online vote. I would love to be able to vote online. Now, to your point about, you mentioned about my reasons that a pen test isn't enough, and Mr. Chair, you mentioned that it sounded like I was looking to have an independent third party, examine some of these issues. Certainly, I absolutely think that there needs to be some degree of public engagement in this process, some degree of independence. Again, you are dealing with private, for-profit companies who, again, nothing wrong with them, but they are representing a business interest first. And so, if you're a chief electoral officer or a clerk and you're trying to get a full picture, and in the case of the small towns in Ontario, many clerks only were able to, they only had the resources to talk to the vendor. They didn't have resources to hire subject matter expert, independent, professor or whatnot, that kind of thing. So they're not able to get the other side of the argument. And I think that's really kind of what really needs to happen here is that there are, it's not even just that it's independence, but that some more critical questions would get asked. I recall the chief electoral officer said in her statement, from the other day, June 10th, I believe it was, I recall that she had mentioned that she had only spoken to the vendor 2 or 3 times. So, it's not necessarily just about independence, but it's also about comprehensiveness. So I think that there are more questions that needed to get asked, and whoever asks them is a separate issue. Now, to sort of answer your point more concretely, who are the people that do this? Well, I know that in the case of Switzerland, they just put together a committee. And now, obviously, you're talking about the federal chancellery of Switzerland, which has a degree of resources that an Ontario city or a territory may not have access to. But they actually put together a list of independent experts, experts who are not being who are really in a position to give you the straight goods and not present anything in any other way, to really kind of who are incentivized to give you the critical sort of side of it, so that you can have both sides to then make your decision with all the facts on the table. So anyway, so that's what I'm saying. A greater sense of completeness, maybe a different group of people who represent a different view, just so that you have both sides represented when you are making that decision. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Last question from me, and then I think we'll need to wrap it up, is you've talked a little bit about this notion of standards. You've talked a fair bit about it. You've mentioned that there's been some discussion of whether they should be developed at the federal level and who should maybe do that. I know there's like the Canadian Standards Association. They tend to do things more on the engineering sort of technical side, but any sense of who might lead that effort in Canada, and what the standards would look like for us being a relatively small jurisdiction, we've got 45,000 people. It's like a municipal vote in Ontario, but it's very, we have people scattered over a third of Canada. We have students away at university. We like to have an opportunity for them to vote. Some of our people go away for months at a time, which makes electronic voting attractive for them. What's our roadmap, and what is the standards start to look like for the Northwest Territories as we move ahead? Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, these are just fantastic questions, and I just really enjoy the fact that I get to be having these conversations with legislators because I think that these are important conversations that we need to have over the coming years. And I do recognize that this is a long-term arc, that this is sort of something that we might hope to leave behind one day for our children. Leave our democratic institutions in a better place. In terms of what this looks like federally, if I could get my wish for Christmas, it would be that the federal government would create an agency like the USEAC that could sort of provide the kind of thought leadership that is really needed to do this. That really could have had the federal scope and the funding to actually bring in all the people that are needed to think through all the questions. When you look at the U.S., they have it's called the TGDC. It's a Technical Guidelines Development Committee. They sit around and they ask all of the many questions. What are the kinds of things that we would want to know that a voting system should be able to do for us to be able to make a standard over it? So one of the things that I heard them talking about in their commission recently was they were talking about the voting machines that they have in the U.S. They have to store them in the off-election times, and so they get dust on them. And so one of the questions they have is how much dust is too much for a machine? So they put that down as something that they wanted to be able to test, and they actually developed a test for dust to measure how much dust the machine would be exposed to over its lifetime and whether that would be too much or not enough, or if it would be okay. So this is the kind of detail that we see them getting into in the U.S., albeit not for online voting, for voting machines, the scanners and the touchscreen machines. So it's a different sort of standard. But I would just be happy if we could ask these any of these kinds of questions. I mean, just to get this ball rolling at all. To get legislatures recognizing why this needs to happen to start moving forward. So this is going to be a long-term process. In terms of what it could look like in the Northwest Territories, and again, recognizing that, yes, you are a huge geographic state. When I was in the U.S. Talking about your election, I actually spoke at Microsoft, and I was pointing out in the U.S., they consider a very big landmass to be something that's bigger than Texas. And so I was pointing out how Northwest Territories is twice the size of Texas, I think even a little bigger. And, they're very impressed by that. So, and that because of those large distances, that actually is a liability for a conventional election. I totally understand that. So one of the ways that you might be able to work towards a better situation would be to, if you aren't willing to sort of completely eliminate an online voting option and go to a mail-in ballot option, which I think is, from my perspective, a mail-in ballot option is a subset of the risk and therefore is a better option. If you're not willing to look at that, at least look at what the elections NWT recommendations are and sort of ask about what scale they might eventually grow to one day. So if you do anticipate that those kind of recommendations could eventually lead to a scenario like in Ontario where you have cities that are 100% online, no paper ballot option at all, and that is something that these legislative changes could lead to in Northwest Territories, then yeah, you better get some kind of standards there. Or if you maybe aren't sure how to approach this question, because I'm not sure how to approach it either, and you realize that it is going to take a long-term approach, that you would sort of limit the scope of online voting until something could be developed, maybe not a perfect dream set of standards, but something that starts this process, starts these questions getting asked. I mean, we're in a time where many of the clerks in Ontario hadn't even thought about some of these things, and now they're thinking about them. And so now we can start to talk about, well, what are some things we could do? What kinds of questions could we ask vendors? I mean, I would just be happy with anything, really, more than what we have right now. That's kind of where I'm going. So, standards are I think, where the puck needs to go. In the meantime, we can look at, guidance documents, some kind of, ways to phrase RFPs. Toronto had a really great online voting RFP. They couldn't find a vendor that met all of their criteria, but they had some great criteria. And then in the meantime, maybe you need to, look at this idea of like opening up the floodgates to online voting and maybe asking if that's really at this moment, given that we don't really have any kind of certainty about what to do about it. I mean, we got, I'm talking to you on a laptop that is governed by all kinds of standards, like for radio emissions and energy levels, and the battery that has the acid in it and all that sort of stuff. We use technology all day long that has all kinds of standards applied to it, and we just need to start looking at doing this. In this case, it's a new world. And we need to start moving in that direction. So any kind of movement in that direction, I think, is positive. I recognize that there are limitations, and so let's see what can be done to move in that direction. Thank you.
Okay, no, thanks very much. We really appreciate your time that you've taken with us today. I think this went a little longer than probably any of us anticipated, but. And we would certainly invite you, if you're so inclined, to make a written submission. I think we've taken a fair bit of your time today already, but if you have any further thoughts, you're welcome to make a written submission to the committee, and as any member of the public is, of course. And we'll make sure that the clerk is in touch with you to advise of any time limits or length limits in terms of submissions and so on. But clearly you've put a lot of thought into this, and we really appreciate your time today. And I think that's it from us today. So thank you very much again for participating with us today in the committee meeting.
Thank you, and happy Canada Day to all of you. Don't work too hard the rest of this afternoon.
Well, we have one more meeting to attend to, so we do need to make our exit pretty quickly. But again, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time today. So committee members, I think that concludes the public portion of our meeting. Again, thanks very much, Dr. Essex. Can I have a motion to go in camera, please? Mr. Thompson. Thank you. The motion's in order. I don't see any objections, so the public portion of our meeting is concluded, and we'll go in camera to consider